Okay, now we're going to talk about animal behavior and why do we specify it just in animals? Because by definition behavior are traits exhibited by individuals in response to stimuli and involves, although it doesn't say here, involves their nervous system. So we're going to be exploring different types of behaviors that we see in animals. How it does what it does and why it does what it does. It involves voluntary muscles, involuntary muscles, and non-muscular activities, hormonal actions, for example. Overall, the study of this is known as ethology, but as we'll see, the specific work that folks do is sometimes described as behavioral ecology, the study of the ecology and evolution of these behaviors. So we can speak about proximate reasons for behaviors. That is, what's the most immediate reason why it's happening, what's triggering the behavior, and what's happening inside the organism. But then we can talk about the ultimate reason, that is, what is the evolutionary significance of this behavior? How is this behavior adaptive for this organism, for this species? How does it help them survive? Okay, let's go to some relatively straightforward behaviors. Fixed action patterns. Unlearned, innate, unchangeable, hardwired. These are things you are hardwired to do, triggered by some kind of external signal. Here in these sticklebacks, for example, these males are hardwired to respond in an aggressive way to individuals that have a particular appearance. So you notice he has sort of a reddish bottom here, and that's what he sees. When he sees that in any of these permutations, he thinks of another male. And so when he sees that, he will automatically attack it. He doesn't even have to think about it at all. Not that he really thinks much, but it's, again, one of these innate fixed action patterns. So his proximate response is to attack that individual. Well, of course, the ultimate goal of this is to defend his territory, chase off intruders, and have access to that territory and any females that are in that territory, and increase his reproductive success. This is something we're going to be looking at in our isopods, and that is movement, which is clearly a behavior, and orientation. And so we're going to be looking at whether or not our roly-poly bugs exhibit kinesis or taxis, and for different kinds of traits. So kinesis is where organisms are moving, perhaps in a random way, until they kind of find the conditions that they desire. And it's thought that perhaps roly-poly bugs might exhibit this kind of trait, in which they just kind of roam around until they find the right kind of conditions. Now, taxis is movement specifically toward or away from or toward a specific stimulus. And so the example we're given are these fish that will tend to orient themselves pointing upstream, which it's easier for them. They have to use less energy to orient themselves that way than if they were obviously sideways, they'd get swept away. And also food tends to come from upstream, and so having your head pointing that way makes it easier to catch them. Just as when you watch grizzly bears, if you've ever seen them fishing up in Alaska for the salmon that migrate, they of course point themselves facing downstream because the fish are coming from that direction. Okay, migration. So this is a pretty prominent behavior you'll see in lots of different species. Birds, obviously, we think of migration. Also, the large hooved herbivorous animals on the Serengeti plains will migrate looking for food. So this is a trait that sort of tends to happen on an annual basis, heading south and then in the winter and coming back north in the spring and the summer. It's often tied into day length, and organisms can use their internal clocks to sense how long the days are or how short they're becoming, and if they're getting shorter, that can be a cue to migrate a particular direction, for example. Okay, communication. Animals can communicate many different ways. They can, of course, use their eyes to receive input and communicate with each other. They can use chemical signals, tactile touch basically, and sound to communicate with each other. So these bees, I don't know if you know this, but bees dance. They do this little dance as a visual cue for others in the hive, and so the guy in the middle is going to do this dance, and the others are sort of watching him, or her, I guess I should say. And you can see this guy has been marked, and so these folks who study this will mark the bees and see what the heck they're doing. And so they do what's called the wobble dance, where they sort of walk and they do this little wobble or wiggle, and they come back around and do it again. And the direction in which they are walking when they do their little wiggle or wobble is basically telling others in the hive which direction to go to find food. So they have found food, and they come back to the hive and tell others, go in this direction and you should be able to find food. Seems to work well for the bees. Chemical cues, different smells, odors can have strong signals for animals. We know, for example, in the mating season with deer and elk and such, the females give off these strong scents, and that's a pretty strong clue to the males that the females are ready, and they go looking for them. Here's an example in fish in which if a fish is injured, then some of its bodily fluids get into the water, and this serves as a signal to others that when this chemical cue is in the water, they sort of hunker down, I guess attempting to hide from whatever it is that may have caused that damage, some larger predator that may have gotten that other fish. Okay, so what about learning? Can animals learn? Well, indeed they can. And so there's a genetic component to this, and also an environment component to this. So when we talk about behaviors that have a really strong genetic component, these are these innate behaviors, again, tend to be relatively hardwired for them and fixed. But individuals can learn over time, and habituation is one way they do this. And that is, if there's a particular stimulus, you may respond at first to the stimulus, but then after a while, if this stimulus results in nothing happening or no danger or whatever the case might be, you just basically learn to ignore it. Imprinting is another type of simply learned behavior, and so the famous example are ducks and geese that will imprint on the first individual they see when they look out of the nest, because that individual should be one of their parents. And so they will fix on that individual early in development, because that's the individual most likely to look out for them. Conrad Lorenz, I believe there's a picture in your book, on page 1126, that shows him walking along with some baby geese following him. He studied this and was able to get these geese to imprint on him to learn that he was their parent. Of course, again, the goal of this is that individual should be the one that is going to take care of them and teach them what they need to know and provide food for them and all. And with endangered species, we have taken advantage of this. These whooping cranes, this species of crane that's relatively rare, they will imprint on, again, what they see when they first hatch out, and they will tend to follow and mimic that individual. So they have taught these young whooping cranes to migrate, and so can't really tell so much, but this individual in this ultralight plane is literally dressed in a crane outfit, and these guys will follow him, teaching them to migrate. Okay, but now there's more advanced forms of learning. And so you can learn what your landscape is like and where food is in it and where to go. And so you will use landmarks to orient yourself. And so this person, Nico Tinbergen, showed that these wasps, some wasps nest in the ground, and so he would find these nests and put these pine cones around it, and so after a while the wasp learned that, oh, that's where my nest is. And then what he does is he moves them, and the poor wasp goes over here thinking, oh, that's where my nest is, but then all of a sudden the nest is not there. But clearly they learned to identify these landmarks with where their nest is. And so what this animal is doing is creating a map in their mind of these objects that they see in their surroundings and associate with certain things. Okay, so this gets at that what we would call associative learning. And you're associating one thing with another. And a good example of this is what's called classical conditioning, or a Pavlovian response, where, of course, the dog sees food and starts to salivate. Now, if you take the dog and you make some kind of sound, the dog, that doesn't mean anything to the dog, it's just some random sound. But now you start doing those two things together. You show them the food and make the sound, and pretty soon the dog starts to associate those things together. Now if you just play the sound, the dog starts salivating because the dog expects there to be food. Just like if your dog at home, you go into the hallway or wherever the dog's leash is, and you grab that leash, the dog sees you, they will get very excited because they have associated the action of you reaching for that leash with them getting to go for a walk. I encourage you to look at the slideshow and click the link. This will take you to a brief video from an episode of The Office where Dwight is conditioned to respond to a sound by expecting an Altoid or some kind of breath mint. Pretty funny. Okay, operant condition. So this is sometimes called trial and error learning, and so you use both positive and negative reinforcement to reinforce some kind of behavior, and it's typically used with dog training. Again, you when they do something well, you give them some sort of reward, and when they don't, you scold them to a certain extent. And so this poor coyote here has learned the hard way to not mess with an porcupine, because now he's got all these quills in his face. Okay, cognition. Cognition is another way, a form of saying to think about things and to use your nervous system to process information you gathered in the past. And so you can use this to solve problems. And we're not the only ones that do this. Here this older chimp is showing this younger one how to smash nuts with a rock, and so this little guy here is learning this behavior from the older one, passing it along. Your book, I believe, talks about some other examples where, and even other things like insects, they can sort of learn. They talk about these mazes and showing the insect a color, and then there'll be the maze, and that color will take them to the food, and they'll learn to associate, oh, if I follow this color, and then they'll switch the color, but the instead of the white side, there'll be the side with a particular color, and even if it's a different color, they still learn, oh, that must be where the food is, and they tend to go that way in the maze. Okay. Alright, I think we will stop here, and I'll do another video for the rest of it.